time to make some canning shelves from reclaimed wood, some leftover varnish, and get all the jars off the counter so my husband can have his counter space back. So step one was making a dado jig for my router. I saw DIY Montreal on YouTube make this straightforward one. I really liked it, so I would go watch her channel on how to make that one. It's some scrap plywood, some T-bolts, and their associated knobs. Pretty cheap, quick to make, doesn't take too long. Once your jig is working well, set that aside and move on to prepping your wood. I had some dimensional 1x12 from my old house that I had the pleasure of scraping for hours on end, getting all the tacks out. I wanted to make sure it was completely free of any metal before I threw my belt sander on there. I came close, but here's what it looks like. It looks a little better. It's all denailed and detacked. This one gives you a better kind of idea of what it is before versus after. I don't want to spend more time scraping a board for wood that I'm not going to use, so I decided after a little scraping that I was going to run it through and get my rough size of my shelving and stuff before I started scraping and doing the whole board here. And this is the simplest and easy way to get a outfeed table-ish using a cast-off part. Typically when I run old boards through, if they tend to be warped, I like to do them cup side down. I think this one had multiple warps in multiple directions, so this was deemed the best way to push it through. Now moving into my favorite part of really getting all the pieces of wood lined up and cleaned up. A lot of before and after stuff, and I only had to go through one belt. I always usually use clamps, put on the tables that it doesn't, when I'm using the belt sander, it doesn't shoot them out the back. These are the moments that I really enjoy when you finally take off 100 years of grime and dirt and paint and nasty, and you end up with just this beautiful grain pattern. It's gorgeous, and that's really gonna pop with a gorgeous finish. From that to that, I think it's impressive. And now with all your wood prepped and ready to go, I'm starting to cut my shelves to length. So I do not have a fancy extended fence yet, but what I do have are 2 pony clamps and some straight pieces of wood. So I'll make my cut, find my length, and then just throw a stop block in there so that I can consistently make cuts that are exactly the same. Now it's time to use the jig, the whole reason I wanted to make these canning cabinets. So I clamped down my long side piece. I marked out where my shelves were going to be, although double check because I did not on one of my passes, and I ended up having to patch later on, which was just a little bit annoying. So you line it up, top and bottom, and then because, again, I'm using old wood, it's never the same dimension, thickness, or width even cut on the same board. So I use the actual board, put it in there, tighten it up, lock it down, and then clamp it down and you're good to go. So for this part, I used a top bearing flush trim bit, 5/8 inch wide and 9/16 deep. Seemed about right. So on the first pass, I took out half the depth of the material, and then on the second pass, I took out the rest of the depth. To try and take it all out in one pass would have torn up the wood pretty bad and thrown a ton of shavings and been a little bit more dangerous and not as clean of a cut. So I always dry fit my projects before I glue them up due to past experiences gone wrong. Because this wood was a little warped, I had to use clamps just to keep it in place. And you can see that double dado, if you will, where the first one's in their incorrect spot. I just made a little patch and put it in there later, and it pretty much disappeared. So after they're all set and dry fit, I decided to do hardwood plugs. They were 3/8 inch, and so I used a countersink bit that was 3/8, and then I did my pilot hole about 2 inches in from each side, so there's uniformity from the top to the bottom. And now time to glue and screw. I did one side and then flipped it over and turned onto the other side. Having been haunted by glue stains in the past, I like to keep a rag and water nearby, and after every glue up, make sure it's all nice and clean and ready for the next one. Now it's dowel time. So this is that 3/8 inch dowel. Always have the size of the dowel before you do your countersink stuff. And back to old stuff. So this is 1/2 inch bead board, and I think 1 or 2 V-grooves that I took off of my old house and got them all kind of stacked according to length to minimize any waste, or to minimize waste in general. And I probably should be wearing a long sleeve and gloves since I'm sure there's lead-based paint in here. I think that thought occurred to me in about 5 minutes. Let's see. There it is, long sleeve and all the gear. Perhaps I'm an oversander, but I like to do 1 round of sanding just to sort of expose what holes there are, and then I like to fill them. Because when you paint over this, you want it to look clean and smooth. So with all holes filled and 1 round of sanding done, time to sand for a second time. I usually use like 60 to get everything down and then hit it with 80, and that's good enough for paint. So I'm putting on 1 coat of primer, and then I'll do 2 coats of paint, and then we will head back to the shelves. I might have neglected to film putting the plugs in, but I did not neglect to actually do it. You just put some glue on them and tap them in, let them dry overnight, and take everything down. I usually clamp a 90 in a couple spots just to make sure. And time to deal with these little plugs. Oh, I was so concerned. You can tell with my face. Ooh, good, good, good. Yeah, just watch your fingers. I've nicked mine a couple times. With the carcass slash body done, I decided that I wanted to throw some little trim around. So I grabbed a couple extra pieces of this beadboard, ripped off the ends, and made it into a little bit of trim. Oh, what's this? More sanding. So before gluing and tacking, I clamp my side trim pieces on so that way I can get a super snug fit with my horizontal trim pieces. So I glued and then tacked. These are 18 gauge and about 1.5 inches long. Probably overkill, but it's what I had on hand. And time for the horizontal pieces. I think I cut each of these twice just because I wanted it to be a super snug fit, because it really shows if it's not. So I have some baseboard where this cabinet is going to sit, and so I wanted it to sit pretty flush against the wall. So the bottom of it is going to sit against the baseboard. So this is this little piece, just a scrap I had. I wanted to get it completely clean before I risked running it through the router, because there can be no nails, no metal in there, otherwise it'll super mess up the blades. Oh, I was so excited to be back in the shop that day. Okay, so you've got your cleaned up piece. Again, I usually like clamping my stuff in place instead of trying to play with a piece of wood in space. It never goes well. So you clamp it down where I wanted. I think I set it up 6 inches. My baseboard is 5.5, and I did not want to risk it, but I was willing to risk this. So I decided to put little tongues on the end of the beadboard that would sit in this slot. And this didn't need to be super centered for me. It just needed to be, you know, just a little slot in the middle. So raised my blade up. I think I did about 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8. Ran it through a couple of times, got it centered. If you run it through on this side and then flip the board around, it'll naturally kind of center itself. So that's what I did. And I think I ran it through 3 or 4 times. I probably could have done a dado stack, but you can fine tune stuff when you're just running it through multiple times. So before I cut beadboard, I measure and make sure I'm going to have minimal waste based on where I place them. So this first one was going to go on the back of the unit, and so I took off the tongue, and that was going to be my my first board as in the row as they went along. So the ends of these beadboards are going to sit in this groove, a little tongue groove. So I took my single blade, put in a dado stack, and it doesn't really matter how wide it is. I'm using a little sled that I used to make shaker style cabinets that I saw Bourbon Moth do on YouTube a couple months ago. They turned out great, and I'm just using this little sled that I will someday upgrade, but that day is not today. Wrenching this tight, keep your fingers out of the way, otherwise it is Murphy's Law that you will smash them. It will be the day. And this is where I did a fair amount of eyeballing because you weren't gonna see these, the profile. And so they just really needed to sit in the groove. So this is a lot of just back and forth and then checking to make sure the tongues fit. So because this first board was going to set the tone, I decided to screw it in, again because of a little bit of board warpage, and the other boards were going to put a lot of pressure on it. But for the rest of them, I used little tacks. I think I used 1.5 inches like I did for the face framing, but it might have been 2 inches. And she's done. Almost. Still gotta sand. Final time. So I decided to finish with an oil-based polyurethane, gave it a little bit of shine, and encapsulated a fair amount of obnoxious old paint from 1945, I am sure. But I really like the artistic way the back turned out. Well, the canning shelves were a success. The way I measured it out, there's minimal wasted space on the top of each shelving. Using the little kind of accent beadboard trim as an afterthought, I was really actually excited about. Gives just enough lip to make me feel a little bit better about having these jars in there. The contrasting plugs that we use for the side, the white against the darker reddish Doug fir, I think really enhances the color of the fir. And working with old wood is always fun. It has a lot of history, and I think there are just some certain colors that you have a hard time finding with newer wood. Maybe it's just me, but I think it really makes it pop. And then with the varnish that I put on, it really makes it that deep, rich, beautiful color. It was very splintery, and that is the downside to working with old wood, but there's a history with it that I just think is hard to get with new wood. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something that you can apply to your next project. So have fun making something.